The lights dimmed as the camera focused on her face, the tension in the air palpable. The host, usually composed and confident, stood in front of the audience, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was silent. The viewers at home were hooked, eyes glued to their screens, waiting for her to speak. "Did you really think you were in danger?" she asked, her voice steady, but with an underlying tension that was hard to ignore. The question hung in the air like a challenge. The guests around her, who had been silent up until this moment, exchanged nervous glances. Some looked bewildered, others almost incredulous. A few shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, as if the question itself had sent a shockwave through the room. Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes locking onto the camera as if to address not just the people in the room, but the millions watching at home. "You see, that's the thing," she continued, her voice calm yet with a weight that made every word seem like it carried years of experience. "The danger was never what you thought it was." The words were simple, but the effect they had was immediate and profound. Everyone in the room seemed to freeze. Even the crew, who were used to seeing their host in various states of calm, now looked unsettled. There was an unspoken understanding that something had shifted, something important was being revealed, but no one could quite grasp what it was. The host waited for a moment, as if letting her question sink in. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lifted her hand and pointed at the camera. "Let me tell you something," she said, her voice softer now, but still carrying an undeniable force. "That danger everyone talks about? It was only a distraction. The real danger? It's far more insidious than anyone could have imagined." A chill ran through the room, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, were left in stunned silence. The host had just dropped a bombshell, one that no one expected. Her response, cryptic yet confident, had stunned everyone. She hadn't just questioned the danger, she had completely rewritten the narrative, and now, everyone was left trying to piece together what had just been said. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching every subtle change in her expression. Her eyes were intense, focused, and for a moment, she looked almost like a different person. There was something about her, a quiet strength that had suddenly emerged from beneath the calm exterior. The guests around her exchanged looks, their confusion now replaced with genuine concern. They had thought they understood the situation, but now, they were uncertain. Had they missed something? Had they misunderstood the true nature of what had happened? And, most importantly, was the host now implying that they had all been in danger without even realizing it? "You think you understand what's going on here," she continued, her voice now carrying a hint of defiance, as if daring anyone to challenge her. "But the truth is, you haven't even scratched the surface." The tension in the room thickened. The host's words felt like a challenge, but it was one that no one knew how to respond to. The moment had shifted from a simple question to a confrontation. The host was no longer just a figure of authority in this conversation, she had become something else entirely. Her eyes never left the camera. She knew the viewers at home were just as captivated as the ones in the room. Every person, whether watching on their screens or sitting in the studio, was now hanging on her every word. As the host finished speaking, she took a step back, giving the room a moment to process what had just been said. The tension didn't ease, but it changed, became something more focused, more intense. The mystery deepened. The audience's curiosity grew tenfold. What was the host talking about? What was the real danger she was referring to? One thing was clear, this was no ordinary discussion. Something far more sinister was at play. But what? That question lingered in the air, unanswered. And just like that, the game had changed. The host's cryptic statement had done more than unsettle the room, it had shaken the foundations of everything the guests thought they knew. Now, there was only one thing left to do, find out what the truth really was. And no one, not even the host, was going to let anyone off the hook until they did. The room remained eerily quiet, the only sound being the hum of the cameras and the occasional rustle of a chair as someone shifted nervously. The host's words still hung in the air, but no one dared to speak. Everyone seemed trapped in a moment of disbelief, trying to comprehend what had just been said. The guests, who had been so sure of their safety moments before, now felt a gnawing unease. The host's words had shattered their sense of security, leaving them questioning everything. What exactly had happened? Was it really as dangerous as she made it seem? It was hard to pinpoint when it all began. It wasn't a single moment, but a series of small, seemingly insignificant incidents that had led them here. Each one, at the time, felt like nothing more than an inconvenience, a fluke, something that could easily be explained away. But now, in the aftermath of the host's shocking revelation, those incidents began to take on a darker meaning. The strange phone calls. The shadowy figures lurking just out of view. The constant feeling of being watched. These weren't just coincidences. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, one that no one had even realized was being put together. The host paced slowly, her eyes scanning the room, watching everyone carefully. She had always been calm under pressure, but now there was an edge to her demeanor, a sharpness that suggested she had known far more than she had let on. The guests had trusted her, had believed she was in control of the situation. But now, that trust was beginning to crumble. "You're all wondering if I was right," she said softly, almost to herself. "If what I said is true, then everything we've seen so far is a lie. A distraction." She turned sharply to face the group, her gaze piercing. "I'll tell you something. The real danger, it's been here all along. And none of us even knew it." Her words hit like a blow, leaving everyone momentarily stunned. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. It was as though the walls were closing in, the sense of safety they once felt now slipping away like sand through their fingers. One of the guests, a seasoned investigator known for his calm demeanor, finally spoke up. His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to keep it steady. "What are you saying? Are you suggesting that everything we've seen here, every incident, was planned? That someone was behind all of this?" The host looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, her gaze piercing through the silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "Everything. Every single thing." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers, disbelief washing over the guests. Could it be true? Had they all been part of some elaborate scheme, some grand deception that they hadn't even noticed? "What do you mean by everything?" another guest asked, his voice rising. "Are you saying that we're all involved in this somehow?" The host's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Not involved. But affected, yes. Every single one of you is here because of what's been happening behind the scenes. But the question is, why? Why you? Why now?" Her question echoed through the room, unanswered, leaving the guests no closer to understanding what was really going on. But there was one thing they all knew for sure now: this was no coincidence. Someone, or something, had been orchestrating events from the shadows, and they had all unknowingly played their part. The host turned toward the window, staring out at the night sky. The city lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the growing darkness in the room. She had been a part of this game too, whether she wanted to admit it or not. But what had started as a mystery had quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. And now, she could no longer deny that the consequences were real. "Remember the first time you felt that something wasn't quite right?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "The feeling you had, that instinct that told you something was off, but you couldn't explain it? That's what I'm talking about. That's the real danger." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension in the room rising once more. They all knew that something had been lurking just beyond their awareness, but they had dismissed it as paranoia. Now, in the face of the host's words, they realized just how close they had been to the edge of something much darker. The host turned back to face them, her eyes locked onto each guest in turn. "The danger is still out there," she said firmly. "And we're all running out of time." As she spoke, a sharp sound echoed through the building, a strange, distant noise that sent a chill down everyone's spine. It was almost as though the walls themselves were vibrating with an unseen force, something that none of them could comprehend. And as the noise grew louder, it became clear that they weren't just facing a threat from the past, something was happening right now. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sound reverberated through the building, echoing down the hallways, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if something, or someone, was drawing closer, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. The guests were on edge, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was no longer a simple discussion. This was something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than any of them had realized. The host stood at the center of the room, her calm demeanor now replaced with a sense of urgency. Her gaze swept over the guests, lingering on each one for a moment, as if weighing them. They had questions, so many questions, but she wasn't ready to answer them just yet. She had a feeling, something told her that the situation was about to escalate far beyond anything she could have anticipated. The air was thick with tension, every eye in the room glued to her, waiting for her next words. But instead of speaking, she slowly turned toward the door. The noise outside was unmistakable now, a constant low hum, growing louder, closer. It was almost as if the building itself was alive, reacting to the approaching danger. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice steady, but with an undertone of alarm. Everyone fell silent. They could hear it now, the strange, unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the building. No one had any idea what it was, but the feeling in the pit of their stomachs told them it wasn't something they could ignore. The investigator, who had been silent since the host's last revelation, stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "What is it? What's happening?" The host didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure herself. But one thing was clear, whatever it was coming for them. And there was no escaping it now. The tension in the room was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity. The guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, trying to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded in the past few moments. What had they gotten themselves into? Who had they angered? And more importantly, what was the real danger? Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and dimmed. A murmur of concern swept through the room as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. The host took a step toward the window, her eyes narrowing as she gazed out at the city. The streetlights below cast long shadows, their light flickering intermittently, as if they too were reacting to the unseen force outside. She could feel it now, whatever had been lurking in the shadows for so long was finally here. And they were running out of time to figure out what it was and how to stop it. "I told you," the host said softly, turning back to face the guests. "The danger isn't what you think. It's not the obvious threats. It's something much deeper." The guests were silent. The room was heavy with the weight of her words, and for the first time since the host had spoken, no one dared to question her. They didn't understand what was happening, but they could feel the shift in the air, the palpable sense of something dark and powerful drawing closer. Then, without warning, the building shook. It wasn't a tremor or an earthquake, this was different. It felt deliberate, as though the very structure was being rattled from the inside out. The sound of something massive shifting echoed through the hall, and the guests leapt to their feet, eyes wide in panic. The host, however, remained calm. She had seen this before. She had felt this coming long ago. The storm that was now descending upon them was no accident. It was all part of the plan, a plan that none of them had seen coming. "The danger is real," she said, her voice firm. And it's happening now. As the guests looked at each other, trying to make sense of the situation, the host walked toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate. She knew they had no time to waste. Whoever was behind this, whatever was coming, they needed to act fast, before it was too late. But as she reached for the door, the lights flickered again, and the strange hum grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just coming from outside anymore, it was coming from within the building. Something was moving, something large, something powerful. And it was coming for them. The host turned back to face the guests. "Get to the safe room," she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Now. And don't ask questions." Panic began to spread among the group. Some of the guests hesitated, unsure of what was happening or where they were supposed to go. Others seemed frozen, unable to move. The host's words had hit them like a wave of cold water, and now they were caught between disbelief and fear. The host didn't wait for them to react. She moved swiftly, her body almost a blur as she made her way down the hallway. The others followed, reluctantly at first, but urgency quickly overtook their hesitation. They had no choice but to trust her now. The host had been right all along, the danger was real, and it was closing in on them. As they reached the safe room, the door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. The host stood in front of the group, her face hardening as she faced them. "This is only the beginning," she said, her voice low and resolute. "Whatever happens next, you must stay together. We can't afford to make mistakes." The storm outside, the hum, the shaking, it was all part of something far larger than they could comprehend. They had been drawn into a web of secrets and lies, and now, they had no choice but to confront whatever came next. The safe room was cold, its stark white walls seeming to amplify the tension that gripped the guests. The only light came from flickering overhead bulbs, casting an eerie glow across the room. They were all gathered together, eyes darting from one person to the next, unsure of whom they could trust, unsure of what to do next. The host stood in front of them, her face pale, but her eyes sharp, alert. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They were all here now, trapped in a small, windowless room with nowhere to go. Whatever was happening outside, whatever had caused the trembling of the building, had forced their hand. They had to stay in the safe room, but for how long? What were they really safe from? She took a slow breath and spoke. "I told you the danger wasn't what you thought. And now, it's time to tell you the truth." The guests looked at her, some with confusion, others with growing concern. It was clear they had no idea what she was referring to. But they could tell that the host wasn't just playing a role anymore, she was no longer the confident figure they had trusted. She was someone who had seen something, known something, and had been part of something far bigger than any of them could imagine. The host raised her hand to silence the room. "Listen carefully," she said. "I knew something was coming. I've known for months now, but I couldn't say anything. I couldn't let anyone know. There were too many lives at stake." A guest, an older man who had remained quiet up until now, leaned forward, his face filled with suspicion. "What are you saying? What do you mean you've known about this? How could you not have warned us?" The host's eyes darkened. "I couldn't risk it," she said, her voice low and steady. "Not until I knew for sure. But now I do." There was a long pause as the weight of her words sank in. The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Was she telling the truth? Was she involved in whatever was happening outside? What could be so dangerous that she had kept it from them? The host's next words were like a punch to the gut. "The danger, it's not from some outside force," she said. "It's not just a random attack or an accident. This was planned. Every part of it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the realization that everything they had thought was true was now in question. The host wasn't just a figure of authority in this situation, she was part of the larger puzzle, a puzzle they hadn't even realized existed. "What do you mean?" another guest asked, his voice quivering. "Are you saying this was all set up from the start?" The host nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "All of it. The phone calls. The strange happenings. The feeling that something was wrong, it was all part of the plan. And the person behind it? The one who's orchestrating all of this?" She paused, her voice lowering. "It's someone close to you." A cold silence filled the room. The guests stared at her, stunned by the revelation. Someone they knew? Someone they trusted? How could it be? Who could be behind such a dangerous scheme? One of the women, who had been standing near the back of the room, gasped. "No, you can't be serious," she whispered, her voice shaky. It's not possible." The host gave her a hard look. "It's possible, and it's happening. The person behind this has been manipulating us all. Watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And we've all been played." The air in the room grew thick with fear. The realization that they were surrounded by someone who had been working against them was more terrifying than the storm outside. Who could it be? Who in their midst could be capable of such treachery? The host moved to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening for any signs of movement outside. The hum from earlier was still present, but it had become faint, as if whatever had caused it had retreated, or perhaps it was just waiting. "I know what you're thinking," the host continued, turning back to the group. "You're wondering who the traitor is. You're wondering who has been feeding this entire operation, who has been watching us. But the truth is, none of us are safe. None of us can trust anyone, not even me." The shock on the faces of the guests was palpable. They had trusted her. She had been their leader in this chaos. And now, they were being told that even she couldn't be trusted? That they were all in this together, but each of them might have been unknowingly part of the plan? The investigator, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his face hard. "Who are you talking about?" he demanded. "Tell us. Who's behind this?" The host took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said quietly. "But you'll find out soon enough. The truth is out there, and it's coming for us." As she spoke those words, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The tension was suffocating, and for a moment, it felt as if the walls were closing in on them. They were no longer just guests caught in a strange and frightening event, they were now players in a game they hadn't chosen to be part of. The host's eyes flickered briefly, almost as if she was looking at something beyond them, something that none of the others could see. Then, without another word, she turned back toward the door. "We need to stay alert. We need to prepare. The real test is coming, and it won't be easy." The guests were left standing in the dim light of the safe room, their hearts racing with uncertainty. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing within the walls of the building. They had no choice but to follow the host's lead, to trust her, at least for now. But how long would that trust last if the truth came crashing down around them? The answers were coming, but they wouldn't come easy. The room had grown tense as the host continued to prepare them for what was coming. They had all been given only a small glimpse of the true nature of the threat. But with each passing moment, the danger outside seemed to draw closer. The hum that had once been distant was now a constant, vibrating through the walls. Something was happening, something they couldn't quite understand, but they could all feel the gravity of it. The host turned back to face the guests. Her eyes, once calm and collected, now flickered with a mix of determination and uncertainty. She had led them this far, but now, with everything hanging in the balance, it was clear that the answers were slipping further from her grasp. "We need to move," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "Stay close. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone except for me." The words hit like a warning, but no one had the luxury of questioning them. They followed her without hesitation, knowing that whatever had brought them together, whatever had set this entire chain of events in motion, was far beyond their understanding. As they moved through the narrow corridors of the building, the distant hum grew louder, shaking the walls with its presence. The host's steps were quick and purposeful. She had a plan, but she wasn't ready to share it with the others just yet. They were too vulnerable, too uncertain. She needed to know who was with her and who wasn't, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by a brief flash of light. Everyone froze, their hearts racing. The host's head snapped to the side, her eyes narrowing. "Get to the back room. Now." Without waiting for any response, she moved swiftly, her footsteps echoing as she hurried down the hall. The guests, shaken by the sound, scrambled to follow her. Fear was now a palpable thing in the air, something that no one could ignore. As they reached the back room, the host stopped abruptly, her hand pressing against the door. She hesitated for only a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the dim emergency lights that flickered weakly on the ceiling. It was cramped, with only enough space for the group to huddle together, their faces illuminated by the faint, flickering lights. The host stepped inside first, her gaze scanning the room as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. She nodded for the others to enter. "We need to stay here until we know what's happening," she said, her voice low. "The threat is closing in. And I'm afraid we're not alone in this room." A ripple of confusion passed through the group. The words, "we're not alone," hung in the air, their meaning far more menacing than anyone could have imagined. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether they were meant to be frightened by her warning or if it was simply part of her strategy. Before anyone could speak, the door to the back room suddenly slammed shut behind them. The sound was jarring, echoing through the space, and for a moment, no one moved. The host's eyes widened slightly. Her hand shot up to her ear, as though she was listening for something. "It's them," she whispered. The group stiffened. "Who?" one of the guests asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. The host didn't answer. She simply motioned for them to stay quiet. Her face was taut, her body coiled in alertness, as though waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered and went out. For a moment, they were plunged into complete darkness. Panic began to rise in the room. One of the guests swore under his breath, while another muttered a prayer. The host, however, remained composed. She moved with a steady, practiced calm, her hand reaching out to guide the others. "Stay close," she ordered, her voice carrying a calm authority. In the dark, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Each guest could feel the tension building, the air thick with the uncertainty of not knowing what was coming next. The hum from outside had turned into a low, ominous growl, reverberating through the walls of the room. And then, a faint noise reached their ears. A soft scraping sound. Almost like footsteps. The host's eyes narrowed, and she quickly motioned for everyone to be silent. "They're close. Don't make a sound." Every breath felt too loud, every movement too risky. The air was thick with the unknown. They were trapped in this room, and the walls seemed to be closing in with every passing second. And then, suddenly, a shape emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague outline, but as it moved closer, its details became clearer. A figure in black, moving silently through the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The guests gasped, some stepping back in fear, while others froze in place, unable to move. The host took a step forward, her face hardening. She knew who this was. This wasn't just anyone. This was the enemy. "Stay behind me," she whispered to the others. "I'll handle this." The figure paused for a moment, as if considering the host's challenge. Then, with swift, precise movement, it advanced. The tension in the room skyrocketed as the figure raised its hand, revealing a glinting, metallic object in its grip. The host moved faster than anyone expected, stepping between the guests and the figure. Her voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the air. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying authority. "We've been playing your game long enough." The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, staring at her with an eerie, unblinking gaze. The host's hand moved to her side, and in the next instant, she was holding something, a device, a tool of some kind, that no one had seen before. She raised it slowly, her eyes never leaving the figure's. The figure in front of them stood unmoving, like a shadow poised to strike, but the host didn't flinch. She was calm, too calm for anyone's comfort, her grip on the device firm, her eyes locked with the glowing ones of the figure. The rest of the guests stood in terrified silence, unsure of what to do or how to react. They had been thrust into a situation that none of them could comprehend, and now, it seemed that their survival depended on this very confrontation. The air felt thick with tension, and for a moment, it seemed like time had frozen. The room was still, silent, save for the soft hum of the mysterious force outside, now even louder as if echoing through the very walls of the building. Then, without warning, the figure moved, swiftly, unervingly fast. It lunged forward, but the host was ready. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the device in her hand, and suddenly the room lit up with a blinding flash of light. The figure recoiled, temporarily stunned by the sudden burst of energy. The guests took a collective step back, their hearts racing as they watched the host confront the intruder head-on. For a moment, the figure seemed disoriented, as though the light had thrown it off balance. The host took advantage of the opportunity and stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Get to the exit," she commanded. "Now." The guests didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled toward the door, their minds barely able to process the urgency of the situation. The host turned to follow them, but as she did, the figure recovered, its movements far quicker than any of them had anticipated. It lunged again, but this time the host was ready. She pressed another button on the device, and the room was filled with a sharp, almost deafening sound. The figure recoiled once more, this time more violently, as if struck by an invisible force. "Move," the host shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The guests rushed for the door, some stumbling in their panic, others pushing ahead. The host stayed behind, making sure the last of the group got out before her. As the door slammed shut behind the last guest, the host turned to face the figure one more time. It was moving slower now, its movements jerky, as if the force of the device had temporarily incapacitated it. The host took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. This was their chance, their only chance to escape. She looked around the narrow hallway, her eyes scanning for any other threats. She knew they couldn't stay in the building much longer. Whatever this figure was, it wasn't the only danger they were facing. The true force behind everything was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they would face it head-on. "Follow me," the host said, turning back to the group, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable urgency. "There's another way out, but we need to move fast." They didn't hesitate this time. With the host leading the way, they rushed down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The building seemed almost alive, the walls shaking and groaning as they ran. It was as if the very structure was reacting to their movements, pushing back against them. The host led them through a series of back corridors, each one darker and more claustrophobic than the last. The tension was unbearable. They didn't know who, or what, was still watching them. And every step they took felt like they were getting closer to the final confrontation, to the moment when they would either escape, or be trapped forever. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the corridor. The host paused for a moment, her hand resting on the cold metal of the door. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were close to escape, but not yet free. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Once we're out, we need to get as far as possible. Don't look back." With a final push, she opened the door. The sound of the outside world flooded in, rain, the distant hum, and the sound of their own breathing. The guests rushed through the door, blinking against the sudden brightness. The host was the last to step outside, but just as she crossed the threshold, she heard something, a low, unsettling growl from behind. She didn't need to look to know what it was. The figure from the building was still out there, hunting them. The host turned, her expression grim. "We've got to move," she said urgently. "Now." The group sprinted across the darkened street, the rain soaking them instantly. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew they couldn't stay in the city any longer. The danger was real, and it was coming for them. As they rounded a corner, the host stopped, her eyes scanning the horizon. The city loomed dark and quiet in the distance, but the storm inside her was far more dangerous than the one outside. The hum, that constant, foreboding noise, was now almost deafening. They could hear it in the distance, but there was no sign of what it was. It was as if something was building up, something that was about to unleash itself on them all. "Keep moving," the host ordered, her voice steady. "Stay alert. We've got a long way to go." But as they ran, the host couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was only the beginning. They had made it this far, but the true test was still ahead of them. The real danger hadn't even begun. The night felt darker than it should have. The streetlights above flickered as if the city itself was struggling to stay lit. The rain, now pouring heavily, did little to mask the palpable tension in the air. Each of the guests, their clothes drenched and hair plastered to their faces, kept their heads down, eyes darting nervously as they followed the host. Every step felt like a march toward an inevitable confrontation, and yet, there was no clear enemy in sight. They had escaped the building, but the danger was still there, following them like a shadow. No one spoke as they moved through the dark streets. The host had not given them any real explanation, but her movements spoke louder than any words. She was determined, focused, and that kept them moving forward, even when their feet felt heavy, and their hearts were weighed down by fear. Finally, they reached a secluded alley, far from the reach of any curious eyes. The host stopped, her sharp gaze scanning their surroundings before she turned to face the group. The guests, exhausted and anxious, huddled together under the meager shelter of a nearby building. "Stay here," she said, her voice urgent yet controlled. "I need to make contact." "Contact?" one of the guests repeated, his voice shaking. "With who?" The host didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her jacket, pulling out a small, unmarked device that none of the group had seen before. It was small, sleek, and strange-looking, almost like a communications tool, but the way she held it, as if it were something precious, told them it was far more than just that. "This," the host finally spoke, her voice softer now, "is how I've been tracking everything." "Tracking?" another guest asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "Tracking what? Who's behind this?" The host nodded slowly, her face hardening. "The real danger, it wasn't just some random event. It was a test. A test I was forced to take, along with all of you." The words hit the group like a ton of bricks. A test? Forced? What was she talking about? This had never felt like a test. It had felt like something much more sinister, something that had taken them by surprise every step of the way. "You see," the host continued, her eyes scanning the streets as she held the device up to her ear, "the person behind all of this is someone very powerful. Someone who wanted to know how we would react when faced with true danger. And unfortunately, we were all the subjects in their little experiment." The guests looked at each other, their confusion growing. "An experiment?" one whispered. "What do you mean?" We're just pawns in this game. The host paused, her face pained for a moment. Yes. You were chosen because of your connections, your backgrounds, and your weaknesses. I was chosen because, well, because I knew what it would take to survive. There was a moment of stunned silence as the group tried to absorb what she had just revealed. They had been part of an experiment, all of them, subjected to some elaborate test that they hadn't even known was happening. The host's fingers tightened around the device, and she lowered it, staring at it with a mixture of fear and resolve. The real question is, who's behind it, and why? Why were we chosen? She didn't wait for anyone to respond. Instead, she turned toward the group with an almost imperceptible sigh. Listen closely, she said, her voice now a whisper. The mastermind behind this experiment isn't just testing us. They're testing something bigger. Something far more dangerous than any of us realized. What is it? One of the guests finally asked, the question on everyone's mind. What are we really up against? The host met their gazes one by one, her expression hardening as she finally spoke the truth, her voice low and steady. What they really wanted to know was simple. How far can someone be pushed before they break? And how much can they trust their instincts when everything around them is a lie? The air seemed to still around them as her words hung in the silence. The guests stood frozen, their eyes wide as they processed the enormity of what they were hearing. The host was right. Everything they had been through, all of the strange occurrences, the fear, the danger, it was all part of one larger, more terrifying plan. They hadn't just been in the dark about the threat, they had been part of it all along, and someone was watching them, waiting to see how they would respond. But why us? The investigator spoke, his voice cracking as he stepped forward. Why were we chosen for this? The host didn't look at him right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the ground, a deep sigh escaping her lips. Because they knew we would survive, she said softly. They knew we would fight back. They didn't just want to test our ability to survive. They wanted to know how we would react when faced with our darkest fears. Would we remain human? Or would we turn on each other when pushed too far? It was then that the full weight of the situation hit them. They had been part of something much larger than a simple attack, much more calculated and sinister than they had realized. They were pawns in a game of survival, manipulated by forces they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But we're not done, the host said firmly, her voice returning to its commanding tone. We have to stop this before it gets worse. Whoever is behind this experiment, they want more. And we can't let them succeed. The guests exchanged nervous glances, but something had shifted. They were no longer just participants in this twisted game, they were survivors. And now, they were determined to take back control. The host looked at them, her eyes fierce with determination. Now, we fight back. We'll find out who's behind all of this. And we'll make them regret ever starting this game. The tension in the alley was palpable. The group of guests, once scattered with confusion and fear, now stood united with a single purpose. The host had made it clear, they weren't just going to wait and see what happened next. They were going to confront the people responsible for orchestrating this terrifying game, and they were going to stop it, no matter the cost. The rain continued to fall, cold and relentless, but the storm inside them was far fiercer. Each person in the group had felt the weight of the host's revelation. They had been tested, pushed to their limits, and now they knew what was at stake. It wasn't just their lives, it was the lives of others who might be unknowingly caught in this twisted web. The host led them through the dark, quiet streets, her steps purposeful and sure. There was no more hesitation in her demeanor, she knew what she had to do. The device she had used earlier still clutched in her hand, the faint glow from it casting an eerie light on her determined face. The group followed her without question, though fear still lingered in their eyes. They had seen too much, learned too much, and now they were about to face whatever had been lurking in the shadows. As they approached a tall, nondescript building at the edge of the city, the host paused. It loomed before them, dark and imposing, as though it had been waiting for them all along. The hum that had haunted them earlier seemed to be coming from within the building, vibrating through the ground, through the air. It felt like a living, breathing thing, and it was growing stronger with each passing second. "This is it," the host said, her voice a low whisper. "This is where it all ends." The guests looked up at the building, dread settling in their stomachs. They had no idea what awaited them inside. They only knew that they had come too far to turn back now. The host turned to face them, her eyes fierce with resolve. "We're going in," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay close. We move fast and we stay quiet. We don't let anyone know we're here until we find the answers." The group nodded, their fear tempered by the host's unwavering confidence. They followed her into the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The building was eerily quiet, save for the hum that seemed to grow louder as they moved deeper inside. They passed through hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The hum was now all-consuming, vibrating in their bones. It felt as though the building itself was alive, reacting to their presence, to their intrusion. The host didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, knowing exactly where they needed to go. The guests, their senses heightened, followed closely behind. There were no words spoken, none were needed. The reality of the situation had settled in. They were about to confront the heart of the storm, and there was no telling what would happen once they did. At the end of the hallway, the host stopped in front of a large, steel door. The hum was louder here, almost deafening. She turned to the group, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said. "We're about to meet the ones behind this all. Don't forget what we're fighting for. We stop them now, or we become part of their game forever." Without waiting for any response, she stepped forward and pushed the door open. The room beyond was nothing like they had imagined. It was massive, filled with rows of monitors and screens, each one displaying data, images, and maps. It looked like a command center, but the atmosphere was cold, sterile, and unsettling. In the center of the room, standing before a large desk, was a man, tall, dressed in a dark suit, his back turned to them as he watched the screens in front of him. He didn't even turn when the door opened. The host stepped forward, her hand still clutching the device, but she didn't use it this time. Instead, she raised her voice, her words carrying a strength that resonated in the room. "It's over," she said. "You've played your game long enough." The man turned slowly, a calm smile playing on his lips. His eyes were cold, calculating, as though he had been expecting them. "You're too late," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You were never supposed to make it this far." The host didn't flinch. "We've seen enough," she replied. "We know what you've been doing. We know the lives you've manipulated, the people you've used as pawns in your experiment. This ends tonight." The man chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You think it ends here? You think you've won? No. This is only the beginning. You've proven something I needed to know. But you, my dear, have made a fatal mistake." Before the host could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and suddenly, alarms blared, drowning out everything else. The screens around them flashed with disturbing images, images of the guests, images of the host. It was as if their every move had been recorded, analyzed, and anticipated. "Get them," the man shouted, his voice now tinged with a hint of panic. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the group found themselves trapped in the heart of the operation. The host didn't hesitate. She raised the device one more time, pressing a button. A bright, blinding light filled the room, temporarily blinding the guests and the man. When the light subsided, the man was gone, leaving only an empty room filled with flickering screens. The host stood still, the device in her hand, her chest rising and falling with each breath. They had done it. They had confronted the mastermind behind everything, and they had won, at least for now. But as the room grew quiet, the hum outside suddenly stopped. The air felt different, almost too still. The group exchanged uneasy glances. The danger wasn't over. They had won this round, but the fight was far from finished. And in the back of their minds, they all knew one thing for certain: the real storm was still to come. The silence that followed the final confrontation was suffocating. The group stood in the now empty command center, the screen still flickering weakly around them. The hum that had once echoed through the building was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Their breaths were the only sound in the room, each one heavy with the weight of everything they had just experienced. The host, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the man had stood moments before, took a deep breath. Her hand was still clutching the device, but it was clear that the battle they had just fought had drained her. She had led them through the storm, had guided them through the dangers they hadn't even understood at the time. But now, as the dust settled, it was impossible to ignore the truth of what had really happened. The group was free, for now. The mastermind behind their torment had been defeated, but the feeling of victory was bitter. The weight of what they had learned, what they had seen, hung over them like a dark cloud. The fear, the paranoia, the constant feeling of being watched, it was all real. They had been pawns in someone else's game, their lives manipulated like pieces on a chessboard. But there was something more, something that they had learned over the course of this terrifying ordeal. The host turned toward the group, her eyes scanning each of them, as though seeing them for the first time. The guests, still reeling from the events that had unfolded, met her gaze, unsure of what to say or what to feel. "You've all been through something unimaginable," the host began, her voice softer now, more reflective than it had been. "We've faced things that none of us should ever have to experience. But we've also learned something along the way, something that's more valuable than anything the mastermind could have hoped to test." The group looked at her, waiting, listening. The host paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "Sometimes, it takes facing the greatest danger to realize what truly matters. We were all forced into this situation. We didn't have a choice. But what we did with that choice, what we chose to do in the face of fear and uncertainty, that's what defines us. The real test wasn't the one we thought we were facing. It was how we reacted when everything was on the line." Her words hung in the air, settling over the group like a heavy blanket. The host's voice was steady, filled with a quiet wisdom that seemed to have emerged from the chaos they had just endured. "You see," she continued, "we learned the most important lesson of all. It's not about how much control you have over the world around you. It's about how you keep your humanity when the world tries to strip it away. We didn't break. We didn't let fear tear us apart. We stayed together, we fought back, and we refused to let the darkness swallow us whole." The group stood still, absorbing her words. It was true, they had been tested, pushed beyond their limits. But they hadn't given up. They had survived. And in the end, it wasn't the mastermind's power or their fear that had triumphed. It was their resilience, their will to keep going, no matter how impossible it seemed. The host took a step forward, her eyes softening as she looked at each of them. "We're more than survivors. We're stronger for everything we've been through. And that strength, that bond we share, is something no one can ever take away from us." As she finished speaking, the group stood in silence for a moment, each person reflecting on the journey they had just completed. They had come so close to losing themselves, to losing everything. But now, they knew the truth, they were not just victims of a game. They were victors. "We've won this battle," the host said, her voice firm once more. "But the real victory is what we've become because of it." And with those final words, the group turned to leave the room, their hearts a little lighter, their minds filled with the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the host looked back at the building one last time. The storm had passed, but the lessons learned would stay with them forever. The real test had been not just about survival, it had been about maintaining their humanity in the face of something far greater than fear. And that was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The group walked away, united, no longer just pawns in someone else's game. They were free, and they were stronger than ever.